Shalom. What do you think about being afraid? Nobody wants to be afraid. People spend a lot of money on therapy and all sorts of counseling to overcome their fears. And nobody wants to live their life in fear. People have natural anxiety. People are afraid of all sorts of things. But in general, when we speak about the concept of fear, it's considered to be something very negative, very undesirable. Nobody wants to be afraid. And it's also thought of as being kind of a weakness. And of course the question might be, what do we mean by fear? And we taught previously that the great Rabbi Nachman teaches that a person has to be afraid. A person has to have a certain amount of fear. Because he teaches when a soul comes into the world, there is a decree that God makes that a person has to have a certain amount of the fear of heaven, the awe, the tremendous feeling of being overwhelmed and of being humbled before the greatness of God. And Rabbi Nachman teaches that if you aren't afraid of God, if you try to basically to cast that yoke of responsibility which goes with the fear off and be just for yourself and basically be in denial of your relationship with God, then God sees to it that instead of being afraid of Him, you'll be afraid of other things. In other words, what he's teaching is quite unique, and that is that you have to have, there's a quota, as it were, that's allocated to every soul of fear. And God's decree, which is quite merciful and compassionate, is that if you have the presence of mind and the maturity and the wisdom to realize who you really have to be afraid of in this world, what you have to be afraid of, and that's doing the right thing for God, then you won't be afraid of anything else. But if you don't use that attribute of fear to be trembling, as it were, before heaven, then He will see to it that you will have to channel your quota of fear into all sorts of things that you really don't have to be afraid of at all. But in other words, you can't get away from how much fear you're destined to have. The question is what you'll use it for. So, this week we are reading in the Torah the first portion of the book of Exodus, Parshat Shemot, and things change very rapidly before our eyes. The generation of Yosef is gone and forgotten, and Joseph, the great righteous one who saved Egypt and the whole world from starvation, is quickly forgotten. And now the children of Israel are blessed with the ability to be fruitful and multiply, and they are becoming a nation in what's called the crucible of Egypt, and they're going to be enslaved. So we have very, very unusual sequence of verses in the beginning of Exodus, and we're reading about these Jewish midwives, and their job was to assist the women of Israel in the process of giving birth. So the king of Egypt, the Pharaoh, spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom the name of was Shifra, and the other was named Puah, and he said, when you do the office of midwife to the Hebrew women, in other words, when you come to assist in their birth, you should look upon the birthstones. That's the whole stone that they're sitting on, a certain kind of seat. The women have this certain kind of natural position to give birth. It's called the birthstones. If it be a son, then you shall kill him. If it be a daughter, then she shall live. But the midwives feared God, and did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but saved the boys, saved them alive. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives and said to them, why have you done this thing that you've saved the boys? And the midwives said to Paro, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, they're lively, and they're delivered before the midwives even come to them. So they came up with some kind of an excuse. It seemed to be saying that, well, the Hebrew women are such proficient birthers that by the time we come to help them, they've already delivered and they're out of there, so there is nothing we can do about it. But verse says that God dealt well with these midwives, and the people multiplied. And then we have this verse, it's chapter 1 of the book of Exodus, verse 21. And it's actually quite mysterious. It says, "And it came to pass, because the midwives feared God, that he made them houses." Very difficult to understand in simple English. That the midwives feared God, and so God rewarded them by making them houses. Now, the great Rashi cites a tradition from the Talmud, from Tractate Sota, that this is a reference to the houses, as it were, of the priesthood and the Levitical line and the kingdom. Three distinct kind of like bloodlines in Israel. Each one is referred to as a house: the house of the kahuna, the priesthood, the house of the Levites, and the house of kingdom, and that is what is being alluded to in this verse. But on the basis of what we began discussing, the concept of fear, I would like to offer an alternative explanation, and a very simple one at that. You know, the way we think about fear, the way most people would define the attribute of fear, maybe lopping it all together, anxiety, a feeling of being very unsettled, a feeling of being not in control, very vulnerable. Well, you know, the concept of a house is the opposite of that. A house is something that is settled. It is established. It is your safe place. Nobody can come into your house and bother you. That's your space. So the concept of a house basically conjures up the idea of being very settled, being very, really focused, and not feeling kind of scattered, feeling okay, feeling safe. It's like the image of being really in control. I have a house. So we would think, if we were to understand the concept of fear, the way most people treat it and spend their lives trying not to be afraid, we would think that fear begets a feeling of being out of control, being frightened, being scattered, not being focused, not being settled, not having a house, as it were. And yet this verse is telling us that because the midwives feared God, God made them houses. So, with all due respect to Rashi, we don't really have to take the verse and find this extra meaning that the houses refers to the line of the priesthood and the Levitical line and the kingdom. You can just really understand it this way, that because the midwives feared God, God granted them this concept of total tranquility and focus and the feeling of being in control. That's what the idea of a home is. And this is a very novel idea, because normally we consider fear to be something that causes us to be out of control, and that's why nobody wants to be afraid. But the lesson of the Torah is that if we have the proper degree of true fear, awe, reverence, humility, trembling before God, we needn't worry about anything else, not the pharaohs of this world, and not his decrees or punishments. And the gift, the reward of the Hebrew midwives was that because they feared God, God dealt well with them and gave them houses. He gave them tranquility, he gave them presence of mind, he gave them not anxiety, which comes from fear, but the feeling of total peace, the feeling of being settled and sure that comes from true fear, channeled fear, proper fear of God.